Hello, everyone, and welcome. I am Karen Yarhimilo. I am the Dean of the School of International Public Affairs, CPAB, and the Adlai E. Stevenson Professor of International Relations, and I am really, truly honored to be kicking off this timely event. I don't need to explain in this room how important the 1973 oil embargo was to the geopolitical landscape or the global energy markets. What the embargo showcased vividly, perhaps for the first time in modern history, is how complex and intertwined these challenges are. It was as true then as it is today. The recent terror attacks, the horrific terror attacks in Israel, they were horrific in so many respects. Over 1,200 civilians, 1,200 people killed, well over 100 citizens and soldiers kidnapped. I think the numbers are around 150 and or up of that. And while our immediate thoughts are with the victims and our attention is on the military operation expected, we should not forget that wars like this could potentially send shockwaves throughout the global industries, including energy markets. These attacks also remind us that we cannot study issues like energy and not pay attention to geopolitics, climate change, technology, or yes, terrorism. It is also true that with those horrific attacks, Israel now retaliated and with massive airstrikes and what looks like going to be a beginning of a sustained ground operation. There's a lot of things about this episode that make this very different from past Israeli-Hamas wars. One is how it started with the massive intelligence failure, security failure, but also the sheer number of civilians targeted, but also very significantly the taking of hostages, civilian hostages back to Gaza, and what this means for ground operations in Israel for the first time will be conducted with so many hostages back in Gaza. It is going to be a very, as I said, a sustained operation. We are already seeing hundreds of Palestinian fatalities, many of them civilians. We are going to see more of that, unfortunately, from both sides in the weeks to come. And I think I was just in class talking about the importance of our community, especially in these kinds of times, to be empathic, to be compassionate, to show compassion and empathy to one another, and to hopefully we come through out of this together as one community. There's a lot, there's raw emotions, there's a lot going on this campus, and I urge everybody to exercise empathy and compassion in those trying times. We know in Israel that there is now a war cabinet that has been formed. So I guess that we will see more decisions about the ground operations coming out from the government soon. Obviously, another huge consideration and risk is whether or not other actors will join the war, especially Hezbollah, Iranian sponsored militias in Syria. And for that, we saw President Biden with a very strong deterrent threat, but it remains to be seen what other actors are joining, and if they're joining, and in what way, and when, and so on. So I grew up in the Middle East during the aftermath of the Arab oil embargo and the Yom Kippur War. It was a time of tremendous uncertainty and unrest. But this experience informed at least my decision to study political science at Columbia, specifically how psychology shapes leaders' decision-making during crisis. And I have the honor of teaching now a class with Secretary Hillary Clinton, on how leaders and their teams can solve problems and craft smart policies during crisis. In fact, I just came back from a class today, as you can imagine, talking about those issues and what's happening in the world, and there was a lot to discuss. Well, there is maybe no better case study than the oil embargo of 1973, a critical juncture that helped shape the modern era and posed so many thorny questions for decision makers, many of which still remain unresolved even today. The embargo reshaped energy markets. Oil was no longer just a source of fuel, it was a currency which countries could use to disrupt governments. There were long lines at gas stations, fears of imminent recession, and summer heat that made the world pay attention to energy not for the very first time, but for the first time, I think, and made the Middle East a high priority for US policymakers. In 1973, we also witnessed the Yom Kippur War, when Israelis were famously caught off guard by a surprise attack, coordinated attack by Egypt and Syria. It was the country's most serious intelligence and security failure until the devastating terror attacks of the past weekend that showed once again how a combination of misguided concept about the adversary, about reliance or particular kind of intelligence collection mechanisms, and under reliance of others, or not thinking about them as the Israeli intelligence should have, in terms of information that probably came from other sources that was ignored. But also the intelligence failure of 1973, this will be studied as there will be a postmortem on what just happened. And as with 73, it took some time to understand what were the signals that were ignored. And in this case, as you can imagine, there will be a lot of information coming out in the next weeks about how Israel got it wrong, why did it happen. So none of the challenges of 1973 have gone away, even in issues of intelligence. And we still face uncertainty and unrest in the Middle East. We still face violence and war. And again, the horrific attacks of the past week have shown. And yet we face a world dependent on fossil fuels to power the planet. That is also true. The dynamics around the intersection of energy markets and geopolitics have only grown more complex, much more complex, which makes the urgency and need for discussions like today, like this one, so timely and so important. And I am very grateful for Jason and for CJEP for putting this together. It is now my pleasure to introduce Daniel Jurgen to the stage. He will deliver this evening's keynote address. Dan is one of the world's most highly regarded experts on energy and its intersection with geopolitics and global economics. He literally wrote the book on the subject, The Prize, which won him the Pulitzer Prize. He's currently the vice chairman of SAP Global, and he has been so instrumental to the success of the Center of Global Energy Policy since day one. I know how much of a mentor he has been to Jason Bordoff in his career and to his effort to build a center on global energy policy from scratch here at SIPA. And believe me, as we're building the Institute of Global Politics, we go to Jason and we learn a lot from how he put together such a stellar center, and for all of his advice, for his friendship, for his support. I'm very grateful. Thank you, Jason. Dan has been a longstanding member of CJEP's advisory board, offering much valued counsel on how the center can deliver evidence-based and actionable climate and energy solutions. We are simply thrilled to have Dan here tonight, so please join me in welcoming him to the podium.
Thank you, Dean, for those gracious welcome, but thank you also, most importantly, for your thoughtful remarks and framing the importance of this whole discussion that we're going to have today. Very pleased to be part of it. And certainly last summer, Jason called me and said, you know, it's a very important event that really defined the energy world for the half century to where we are today. We should do something at the center. And so, Jason, thank you for thinking of it, and thank you to the center. And I have to say that it's been a source of great satisfaction to me to have a role in being able to see this center come from just an idea to become the most important energy center really in the world, certainly in the United States, and the impact it's having. So the Dean set the framework. This is about energy and geopolitics. She used the word shock. And of course, 1973 was the biggest shock that had occurred, at least up till that time. And so it's my job really to set the stage for the panel that's going to come by actually explaining and talking about what actually happened, because, you know, it's out there as a concept, but what actually unfolded. The 1973 crisis was about oil, as the Dean said. It reset geopolitics and reordered the global economy in terms of flows of money. I think it did further, and I think that's what we're going to hear on the panel. It really introduced the modern age of energy in a way that just had not been seen before, in an integrated way. The crisis and the iconic photographs of angry motorists fuming in gas lines are often evoked whenever we see a price spike. But those dramatic events of 1973 have retained a wider imminence and relevance. For the consequences set the course of so much that has happened in terms of government policies, investment, and indeed in terms of innovation. And I think it has remained really the benchmark against which energy developments are judged. Obviously, as the Dean said, as we all know, the horrific events that began last Saturday have brought the 1973 crisis into even sharper focus. For Hamas deliberately chose the 50th anniversary of the Yom Kippur War to launch its assault, and chose the Jewish Sabbath when attention would be lower. And once again, as the Dean said, as in 1973, in a sort of starkly amazing way, the attack represented a massive failure of intelligence and preparedness on Israel's part that will be the subject of much discussion thereafter. But of course, so much is different. World oil demand today is literally more than twice what it was in 1973. And today, the US is the largest producer of oil, not as it was in 1973, on its way to becoming the world's largest importer of oil. And oil was about 50% of world energy in 1973. Today, it's 33%. We have a much more diversified energy mix than was the case then. Energy weapons. Vladimir Putin sought to use an energy weapon, the gas weapon, against Europe recently, but it failed. And the oil weapon is still a thing of the past. The major Arab Gulf producers are in various states of dialogue with Israel and view Hamas, I think, as an enemy aligned with its most important enemy, which is Iran. But of course, all the risk remains in terms of what is going to happen in the weeks ahead, how the conflict develops, and how that would affect the flow of oil and natural gas. And I would emphasize also, and the infrastructure that enables those flows. So the 1973 crisis, to frame it, was distinctive, and so tumultuous is it because it represented a convergence of three different crises. One was geopolitical, one was energy, and one was a political crisis in the United States. But, and this is my charge, is to answer what actually happened in 1973 and why. I hope by addressing them, I'll provide a framework for the discussion to follow. And then I have just a couple of lessons from the crisis. Now, oil has been recognized as a strategic commodity ever since the First World War. That war had begun with cavalry charges and rigid railroad schedules and ended with trucks, tanks, and airplanes. The enormous change was captured in the words of Britain's Lord Curzon at a banquet just after the war. He said the Allied cause, he said, floated to victory on a wave of oil. And I think it was World War I that really established oil as a strategic commodity, or as the strategic commodity. In terms of World War II, oil was a critical dimension of the overall war. In fact, an oil war was part of the overall war. Out of every 7 barrels of oil that the Allies used, 6 of them came from the United States. In the Atlantic, German U-boats sought to sink the tankers that were carrying American oil to Europe. And in the Pacific, one of the US Navy's priorities was severing Japan's supply lines for oil. And then the criticality of oil was subsequently demonstrated by the disruption of supplies to Europe during the 1956 Suez Crisis and then the 1967 Six-Day War. In 1967, building upon ideas that had been out there, Arab oil exporters had sought to mobilize the oil weapon. What was the oil weapon? The idea was to use an embargo against Western countries to pressure them to cease support for Israel. But the weapon misfired. It failed. At that time, the oil market was in surplus, and the United States had spare capacity. That is, additional oil production that could be called into use, which was not being used at the time, but which could be called into use and mobilized against an embargo. But what happened is over the next half decade, things really changed. Market dynamics changed dramatically. The post-war economic miracles of Europe and Japan accelerated the demand for oil, and cheap oil in turn fueled economic growth. Just consider, between 1960 and 1972, world oil demand more than doubled. It more than doubled. And then environment was a further driver of demand. Oil was being used to replace coal in electric generation in order to reduce pollution, including here in New York City, where Consolidated Edison, Con Edison, started importing low sulfur oil from Nigeria to replace coal. On a global basis, supply simply could not keep up with demand. Low prices were not stimulating investment, and circumstances were rapidly changing in the United States. The great stabilizer in the world oil market had been US spare capacity. And that was regulated notably by the Texas Railroad Commission in Texas and by similar commissions in other states, oil-producing states. What the Texas Commission did was set production levels, so-called allowables, how much oil you would be allowed to produce below the actual capacity of the wells it regulated. The reason going back to the 1930s was to deal with overproduction and waste that had driven oil prices down as low as 10 cents a barrel. The effect was really, as I thought about it, was to create a strategic oil reserve, although no one called it a strategic oil reserve at the time. But in 1971, with world demand surging, you came to this critical moment when the Texas Commission removed the limits, permitting production at 100% of capacity. We feel this is a historic commission, the chairman of the commission said, damned historic and a sad one, because he said Texas will no longer be the warrior that could bring up oil, and said the old warrior can't rise anymore. And yet even US production at full throttle was not enough. By 1973, the United States, which had been this major exporter of oil, was actually importing a third of its oils. And it was not only oil that was becoming in short supply, it was also natural gas. Interstate natural gas prices, and this gets you to the question of regulation and government policy, were regulated by the federal government at a very low level, so there was very little incentive to produce new gas. So beginning in 1969 and 1970, which was, by the way, the coldest winter in 30 years, you started seeing shortages, schools and factories were shuttered. Already by the spring of 1973, people were talking about an energy crisis, and yet there was little imagination. And so much when people talk about failures of intelligence, it's the failure of imagination. People couldn't imagine how serious a crisis could actually become. So even as the United States became more dependent on imported oil, there was very little recognition of the US role as a growing consumer and how rising US imports would compound the market pressures coming from the economic miracles in Europe and Japan. Major new oil reserves had been discovered in Alaska, but it was impossible to get approval to build a pipeline until the summer of 1973, when then Vice President Spiro Agnew, as president of the Senate, broke a tie that enabled the development of the pipeline to begin to move ahead. That's how divided the country was on the issue. So on the supply side, and here's where geopolitics started to become more and more obvious, the oil exporting countries were mobilizing to increase their share of revenues and assert greater control or outright nationalization. Until then, the companies had set the posted or official price. But now the exporting countries were saying, we want to set the price. We want to be in control of pricing. Tense negotiations led to increases in the price of oil, but the increases were still measured in dimes and quarters. 35 cents or 95 cents were the type of increases. The U.S. and its allies warned a U.S. embassy official who was monitoring these in negotiations in Tripoli, said, and I think he got it right then, he said that officials, but people were unprepared intellectually and politically to deal with the changed balance of power in the petroleum supply situation. The exporters were able to achieve their goals because that balance between supply and demand had so narrowed. And come down to, people ask me sometimes who the most important and interesting characters in my book on oil, the prize that the dean mentioned. I said the two most important characters, one is named supply and one is named demand. And that's exactly what we saw happening here. In April of 1973, another State Department official published an article in Foreign Affairs whose title told all: the oil crisis, this time the wolf is here. There was hardly broad assignment because that was in Foreign Affairs. Foreign Policy magazine immediately rushed out with an article declaring that the world energy crisis or shortage was a total fiction. And yet during that time, the markets only continued to tighten. By the third quarter of 1973, there was hardly any spare capacity of oil anywhere in the world that could be called upon. An industry newsletter reported near panic buying in the world oil market. And at the end of September, the Japanese prime minister warned that an oil crisis could come within 10 years. It actually came within 10 days. And that brings us to the geopolitical crisis. The 1967 Six-Day War had changed the balance in the Middle East. Israel had taken control of the Sinai and the West Bank. Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser was a great advocate of pan-Arabism, and his voice echoed across the transistor radios in the Middle East. But he died in 1970, leaving his successor, Anwar Sadat, considered a weak figure very much in the shadows. But Sadat was determined to reverse the outcome of the '67 war. He concluded that the only way to do that, to compel negotiations with Israel, was with a new war, and Syria was with him. By August of 1973, he had persuaded Saudi Arabia's King Faisal to consider using the oil weapon as part of the overall war plan. The king remembered that the oil weapon had failed in 1967, and that had cost them in terms of lost revenues, and so he needed to be persuaded. But he recognized that the dramatic shift in the world oil market would provide the firepower necessary to wield the oil weapon. For now, Saudi Arabia, and not the United States, had become the swing producer in the world oil market. The war was unleashed on October 6, 1973, with massive air and artillery assaults. The choice of that date was aimed at achieving maximum surprise. For October 6 was Yom Kippur, the holiest Jewish holiday, and Israel was highly unprepared. The massive intelligence failure, as the dean referred to, would subsequently be subject to much review. One reason was the oft-repeated failure of imagination. Another was excessive self-confidence and complacency that had come from the outcome of the Six-Day War. But there also had been two previous feints by Egyptian forces earlier in 1973, and Israel had mobilized, and the defense minister was being criticized for wasting money for having responded. So there was kind of inertia against responding. Faced with that onslaught, Israel's unprepared military fell back, disordered. It was quickly exhausting its arsenal of weapons. Israelis desperately pleaded with Washington for more arms, for its very existence was at stake. The Soviets were resupplying their Syrian ally. And in the formulation of Henry Kissinger, he said a US ally cannot be allowed to lose to Soviet arms. So casting it in terms of the larger Cold War. The US mounted an airlift, but then came the unfortunate matter of the winds. Defense Secretary James Schlesinger, some years later when I was researching the prize, told me of the problem that had occurred during the resupply, that the giant C-55A cargo planes were meant to land under cover of night in Israel, supposedly to be less visible and thus less provocative to the Arabs. But the plane's departures were delayed by nature, by crosswinds on the runways in the Azores where they were to be refueled, and they ended up landing in daylight. There could be no doubt that the United States was coming to the aid of Israel. 10 days after the start of the war, the OPEC countries met in Vienna. It was no longer a matter of 35 cents or 90 cents a barrel. They increased the price by 70% to $5.11. And to go back just 3 years, in 1970, the price of oil was $1.90, which would today be $14 a barrel. So they raised the price. And then we come to the embargo, because the next day, the Arab oil exporters met in Kuwait. In response to this clear US support for Israel, they agreed to cut back on production by 5% a month. The United States and the Netherlands were singled out for complete embargoes. And the oil market went into fevered panic as companies desperately competed for supplies. One can clearly trace the energy crisis and the geopolitical crisis. What is more difficult to assess is what impact resulted from the fact that the United States was gripped in a political crisis, one that went to the heart of the legitimacy and the authority of the presidency. Would there have been a different outcome if there had been a president in command rather than a president in retreat? Would the United States have been able to play a more decisive, balancing role, and would the rest of the world have thought differently about the United States? It was a relevant question then, and I have to say it has to be a relevant question today as other countries around the world try to make sense of the disarray in Washington and what comes from that. Richard Nixon was clearly destined to win the 1972 presidential election, but that wasn't good enough. It wasn't good enough for the Nixon campaign. And so there was that famous break-in of Watergate at the headquarters of the Democratic Party, which Nixon dismissed as a third-rate burglary, but it led to a whole series of revelations, a series of criminal activities and cover-ups that would become known as Watergate. So by October of 1973, as this crisis is unfolding, the investigations and their reverberations are dominating Nixon's agenda and undermining his authority. Amidst the crisis unfolding in the Middle East and the global energy market, Nixon was preoccupied with his own political survival. In fact, as I thought about this and went back and looked at it, this juxtaposition of Watergate with the events unfolding on the world stage remains jarring to this very day. 3 days after the start of the war, while the Israeli prime minister was signaling that she might fly to Washington out of desperation to seek more aid, Nixon was dealing with an entirely different situation. He was dealing with the resignation of his vice president, who had become ensnared in his own web of corruption and was asking Nixon for help getting some consulting work. While Henry Kissinger was in Moscow trying to negotiate a ceasefire plan with the Soviets, Nixon fired the Watergate special prosecutor, and the attorney general and the deputy attorney general both quit in response in what became known as the Saturday Night Massacre. A few days later, when senior officials met to consider alarming news that the Soviet Union was possibly sending nuclear weapons to its Mideast allies, Nixon was, in the words of one official, too distraught to participate. Henry Kissinger, who had, no one's done this before or since, was both National Security Assistant and Secretary of State, really became the embodiment of legitimacy. For there was as one memo at the time put it, there was no functional president. As Martin Indyk at the Council on Foreign Relations has written, Nixon's preoccupation with his Watergate woes enabled Kissinger to function in the president's place for most of the time. The crisis reached its climax in the last week of October when Soviet ships were seen to be moving in a belligerent pattern into the Mediterranean, and that nuclear material was detected on a Soviet freighter headed into the Mediterranean. In response, the state of US forces was raised to DEFCON 3, a nuclear alert, and it appeared that the United States and the Soviet Union were headed into a direct confrontation, as had been the case in the Cuban Missile Crisis. While that was happening, on that very day, the House Judiciary Committee, the very day of the alert, the House Judiciary Committee announced that it would begin its impeachment hearings. But within a few days, fortunately, Kissinger's diplomacy paid off, a ceasefire went into effect, and Egyptian and Israeli military leaders met for the first time in a quarter century, I think it was, to begin direct talks. So the ceasefire was the beginning of the end of the geopolitical crisis. It was exactly 3 years later. Anwar Sadat was actually in Israel. The Egyptian president was in Israel to address the Israeli parliament. This was followed in 1978 by the Camp David Accord, and a peace treaty between Israel and Egypt was signed in 1979, which I think brought that geopolitical crisis to an end. But a new geopolitical crisis, and a very long-lived one, was beginning at the same time. The Iranian Revolution that toppled the Shah and established the Islamic Republic at exactly the same time, and the consequence of which are felt, I have to say, to this very hour. The political crisis ended in August 1974 with the resignation of Richard Nixon and the accession to the presidency of Gerald Ford, who declared on the day he became president, "Our long nightmare is over, the Constitution worked." What was not over was the energy crisis. Indeed, the 1970s would be the energy crisis decade. In 1973, with panic gripping the world oil market, OPEC raised the price of a barrel, which had been $1.80 3 years earlier, to $11.65. I checked with my colleague Jamie, who's here. $11.65 today would be $80 a barrel. Isn't that interesting? $80 a barrel. In the United States, the spike in oil prices and gas lines, of course, fueled public fury. It was not recognized that the main reason for those gas lines was the inability of markets to respond owing to inflexible government allocation system for gasoline distribution, which meant shortages in some area and oversupply in others. Literally, the federal government was saying where gasoline could go. The market was not able to adjust, and that's really where the gas lines came from. As Henry Kissinger spent months on his shuttle diplomacy working toward Middle East peace, Anwar Sadat, who had been the chief advocate of the embargo, now called for its cancellation. Both he and Kissinger recognized that the United States could not continue its peace efforts with an embargo. So on March 18th, 1974, the Arab oil ministers, saying that they wanted to support continued US efforts towards peace in the Middle East, agreed to end the embargo. Just a couple more comments. Given the enormous impact of the embargo, it is noteworthy to examine the actual amount of oil on a net basis that was removed from the market. It was 9% of total supply. It was 14% of traded oil. But that was not known at the time because no one had information. What buyers faced was great uncertainty, poor information, disruption of traditional supplier arrangements, panicking governments, panicking consumers, panicking companies, publics both furious and fearful, disrupted supply arrangements, and a mad scramble among companies to get cargoes before somebody else got that cargo. I think also I'd like to just point to two lessons from the crisis as I thought about it, and I'm sure more will emerge from this discussion. One is the importance of energy security. It is on the table and then it gets forgotten. But energy security and resilience in the system is absolutely critical. I love the quote that Churchill made to the British Parliament in 1913 when he was converting the Royal Navy from coal to oil, and they said, "You're going to leave safe Welsh coal to go to Middle East oil, actually Iranian oil, Persian oil." And his answer was safety and certainty in oil lie in variety and variety alone. In other words, diversification. When markets are relaxed, though, it is all too easy to let energy security fall off the table. Just one other lesson. I think a second lesson is that when Washington is distracted and in disarray, the world is a more dangerous place. Such was the situation in 1973. And who would say such is not the case today? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dan, for that extraordinary account of events that some of us are old enough to remember, others lived through, perhaps others read in The Prize, your history of oil. I welcome my panelists to join me on stage, and I welcome everyone to join us. This is today's meeting, 1973 Energy Crisis, the Oil Embargo and the New Age of Energy. I'm Vijay Vaitiswaran. I'm the Global Energy and Climate Innovation Editor at The Economist. It's my great honor and pleasure to be your immoderate moderator today for this extremely distinguished panel of experts, and whom I'll introduce in just a moment. Our meeting is being webcast live, and the full video will be available in coming days. And please do submit your questions via QR code. You can find it on the back seat of every other chair here in the live room. For those joining us via Zoom, you'll find a link in your chat function. Let me introduce my speakers here. From my immediate left, of course, someone who needs no introduction in this hall, Jason Bordoff, Founding Director, Center on Global Energy Policy, Professor of Professional Practice here at Columbia SIPA, as well as a professor and co-founding Dean Emeritus of the Columbia Climate School. Next to him, Ed Morse, Global Head of Commodities Research at Citibank. Megan O'Sullivan, Director of the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at Harvard Kennedy School. And to my far left, Adnan Shihab Eldin, Senior Visiting Research Fellow at the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies. Please give them a nice round of applause to welcome them on stage. This, as a longtime student of energy, this really is a dream team to talk about the oil shock and indeed its broader implications for geopolitics, for industry, and through to the arc of today. So I hope to follow that arc and maybe start with history. Jason, let's start with you. Dan laid out a compelling argument that what happened in 1973, 50 years ago, was a confluence of three crises: geopolitical, political, and we can say industry or market. What do you tease from that in terms of lessons we should take away from how the 73 confluence of crises happened and the ripple effects, particularly on energy, which is what we're here to discuss? What lessons are the right lessons to take away? Because there are some lessons we could talk about that may not be the right lessons, pursuit of energy independence or syn fuels. We can go down some of those paths as well. But tell me what you think are one or two of the most important lessons to take away.
It's such an extraordinary history listening to Dan, and just fascinating to think about how it applies today. Several lessons, and he mentioned a couple of them, including a functioning political system, the importance of transparency and data. I think those data points about 9% and 14%, and the problem is we didn't know that. And so we didn't have well-functioning, transparent markets with transparent data. The governance institutions that were put in place after that, like the International Energy Agency and JODI, the acronym for sort of the efforts to try to make sure that we all have trusted and transparent data, that is relevant to the clean energy transition. If you think about how critical minerals markets work, and they're a little more opaque, and futures markets are not quite as deep and liquid, making sure that we have enough data and transparency to allow integrated and well-functioning markets to work. Integrated and well-functioning markets is an important lesson. We saw that in Europe when Russian gas supplies were disrupted. The ability of Europe to go into a global market, increasingly global with gas, because more gas is not just by pipeline, it's now on ships on the water. Prices go up, of course, but there was more security because market forces could help respond. I think that was another important lesson. And the last thing I'll say is what Dan said about the allocation system. The fact that in the United States, to deal with inflation, before the crisis, Nixon had put in place price controls. to keep energy prices low for American consumers. That made the problem worse, not better. That's part of the reason there were lines at the gasoline station. And we see some policymakers say, you know, in Europe and elsewhere, responding to very high prices now by reverting to the same sort of price controls. I think that's a risk, and we're not learning the lessons of the past.
So there are good things that have happened, the advance of information, development of markets, but also some lessons that perhaps weren't learned in terms of intervention in the wrong ways. Ed, let's come to you. You're a man who has his finger on the pulse of certainly what's happening in markets, as well as information. Can you recall for us the age of the kind of integrated energy system that we had back then, and how that might have contributed in some way to the crisis of that time, and how it's changed? How have commodity markets, particularly oil markets, changed in a way that give us a sense of the direction of travel?
Sure. So one of the things that Dan didn't mention was that the 70s followed a period of nationalization of the oil industry. There were 10 major nationalizations that took place in the decade before that, and then there were a lot more in the decade of it. But those nationalizations occurred at a time when the U.S. system really became separate from the rest of the world. And Dan talked a lot about it, but just to note that we had high-priced oil in the United States. The rest of the world had low-priced oil. One of the major reasons that OPEC got together was to find a way to negotiate with the United States, which was keeping oil out by having imposed import controls. And those import controls were designed to protect an American oil industry where prices were in fact higher than those in the rest of the world. So the U.S. economy played a major role in it. It played an even more important role because of the price controls, which incidentally came from a totally non-oil event. The price controls were imposed because the U.S. went off the gold exchange standard, and that was deemed to be inflationary. So a temporary measure was taking place, but it took place in 1971, the same year as Dan goes through in the prize, the same year that Libya decided to test the market by cutting production. And what do you know? The price went up fourfold from a very low number to still a very low number, but it had, you know, serious implications. On your question directly, even with those nationalizations, 85% of the oil reserves of the world were under the control of the Seven Sisters, and 75%.
Which is the precursors of what we call big oil now.
Yeah, big oil now that has been consolidated. There were really 8 sisters, but we call them 7, so that just confuses the matter. But they also controlled 75% of traded oil in the world, and that was a phenomenally different universe in several respects. We talked about the tightness that happened in the market. The tightness in the market was because we had unbelievable demand growth. The demand growth on average was rounded 10% per annum for 2 decades. At 7%, that doubles demand. We had about a doubling of demand when you think about, you know, recessions taking place, but average growth looked like it was 10% per annum. And those Seven Sisters were managing to get refinery capacity, given the fact that they were delivering 75% of the world's oil, to be higher than what the demand was going to be. And the margin was very, very different. I think the consequences of what happened after 73 are remarkably important to think about, even though I know you don't want to get ahead of it. We had 10% per annum growth. And by the end of the decade, we had almost no growth. And indeed, we had a decline in total oil demand around the world. And that decline came about in part, and I know you don't want to flash forward yet to the energy transition, but I would note to those people who say we can never drop oil demand, it's going to be growing year after year after year, there was a major change. And Dan talked about part of that change, moving from other things like coal to imported fuel oil.
You're right, both in your point about demand, but also in that I want to put a pin in that for the moment. I want to come to demand in our next round of conversation, but your point is noted. It was a foreshadowing, and we even heard from Dan's comment about how the 2 main characters in his in book were supply and demand. So to your observation about the balance of markets, is it fair to say, another one of the characters in your fine book, Dan, is what you call hydrocarbon man. That is, we lived through an age in which the world really found many, many more uses for oil, much more so, and not just for burning, substituting for coal in New York. Plastics, we all remember the movie The Graduate, for example. One word for you, Benjamin, plastic, right? And so we found an age in which demand was soaring. Is it fair to say that the Seven Sisters, even with their dominance of the global industry, were underinvesting? Was there a mismatch that could have contributed and given that leverage to OPEC that might not have existed 10 years or 20 years previously?
I think they were doing just-in-time investment, and the events that took place really were, as Dan described it, a situation in which, yes, there was a cut in production, but we had apparent demand growing at a faster rate than real demand. We had a bidding up of oil because the Seven Sisters were incapable of providing it to the rest of the world. So let's say oil demand and oil supply were more or less flattish with one another. There was growth in investment, not as much growth as happened after prices went up, but the change was that those Seven Sisters could not guarantee oil to Brazil, oil to Japan, oil to countries that came in as a government level and bid up the price with one another because of the perception that there were shortages. So I'd say that is a really big lesson.
Jason's point about information or lack thereof and uncertainty. So Megan, coming to you, we've discussed some of the market dynamics, the industry factors, and some of the implications thereof of that crisis. Can you give us the geopolitical outlook? What do you think were the geopolitical implications of the events that were described by Dan, and your perspective on the geopolitical repercussions of the embargo?
Sure, happy to do so, and really happy to be here, and always a pleasure to hear from Dan on these topics. I'd say there's a whole set of kind of economic factors. You know, the world goes into recession, the developing world has a major debt crisis, you usher in a long period of stagflation in the global economy. But since you asked about geopolitics, let me mention a couple of things that I think are really prominent and important. The first and the most consequential is that the US starts to think differently about the Middle East. The Middle East becomes an area of real strategic importance to the United States. If you think of this crisis in 1973, going to the end of the decade, you get the Carter Doctrine, which is, this is maybe not known to many people in this room, but this is when President Carter, says that any infringement on oil producing states in the Gulf is a direct threat to US interest. And then you have President Reagan kind of building on that later, saying it's not just threats from outside countries that are going to be a threat to the United States interest in the Middle East, but even if there are threats from inside countries to existing regimes that could jeopardize stability, that's going to be considered a threat to US interest because of the oil production and because of the lifeline that oil production provides to the US and Western economy. So you really get a sharp change in that. I'll mention one other, we could spend a very long time talking about this, but another very significant geopolitical implication of what happened is that that Saudi Arabia in particular really becomes a very consequential actor on the global stage. And this gets back to, Dan mentioned these major shifts in wealth that occurred during this time because of the embargo, because of the market implications, that countries, Gulf countries, Dan or Ed will correct me, but I think it quintupled the amount of money they were bringing in from oil revenues. So that was a massive shift in wealth to that part of the world. And that ends up being directly connected to what we see in subsequent decades when Saudi Arabia and Iran are spending a lot of money to promote their version of Islam all over the world. And that's where we get the promotion of the Salafis, we get the Iranian promotion of their version of Islam. And this really changes security situation, it changes the regional outlook, and it ultimately sets the stage for the decades and for 9/11.
Yes, jump in.
Yeah, I just want to jump in because what Megan said has a critical element to it. In that period, 73, 74, I was teaching at a university. I happened to have an office next to Paul Volcker, who was happened to be on leave from his job elsewhere at the time, and he wrote a seminal paper on petrodollar recycling and how the U.S. national interest required that that money get recycled through the U.S. central bank and the U.S. banking system. So
Can you give a very short definition of petrodollars for some people in the audience that may not know what it is?
it is. It's the money earned by oil exporting countries that, as Megan said, quadrupled in a very short period of time. And the U.S. at the center of the global financial system took it seriously and had some very serious people taking it seriously.
Of course, part of the reason that came to the U.S. banking system was their economies were so small they didn't have the capacity to absorb that massive.
But they had to be guaranteed.
Inflows, right? And they had to be guaranteed, right? And it was lent out eventually to many emerging market countries that took on debt and fueled the Latin American debt crises, among other problems down the road. So thank you for that. Maybe Adnan, let's come to you. I wanted to ask you about how all this has impacted OPEC. Now, I want to make two things clear. First of all, this, even though sometimes it's mistakenly portrayed as such, the embargo was not an OPEC event, of course. It was the Arab members of OPEC. So it's wrong to call it the Arab embargo. But also, I want to ask you about how you think the impact nevertheless affected OPEC. And as a man who sat in the big seat as acting Secretary General formerly at OPEC, you may have some special insight to share with us. With the benefit of hindsight, how do you think the embargo treated OPEC?
Well, I think, allow me just to even correct you one more time.
Please, please, I stand.
It was not the Arab members of OPEC that did the embargo. It was few Arab countries of OAPEC, and Dan mentioned that.
So a subset
Because the
within a
meeting
subset.
was a meeting of OAPEC
Right.
in Kuwait, and they took a decision by few of the members. So it was not even recorded as an OAPEC decision, because OAPEC was not an organization that involves in these type of things. It was OPEC. So I just wanted to set that
Fair
record.
enough, fair point.
But going to your question about how did that impact OPEC, I think first and foremost, Dan mentioned it and other colleagues, the embargo failed in achieving the political goal that was announced, and that was many Arab nationalists, many countries were calling for, but it failed. Because we know, even with the disruption of supply, the political aims did not succeed.
And to be explicit, it was to shed light on the Palestinian plight, right? That was the
It was
explicit
not
aim.
only that, it was basically, it was to push the Israeli armies back, because initially Egyptians and the Syrians made some advances to recover some land. The Israelis, I was described by Dan, were in sort of some kind of a retreat. Golda Meir was thinking about coming to the US. The political system in the US allowed to take the decision to come to the aid of Israel, and King Faisal had made a commitment to Egypt and Syria that he would not allow that. So the main goal, you could say it was the Palestinians, but mainly at that point in time, it was to make sure that the Egyptians and the Syrian armies are not defeated. They used the weapon, and at the end of the day, it didn't work. But I come back to the point. What happened is that there was already an effort, starting in Iran, 1951, nationalization of oil that failed, and then 67, and then, of course, Libya coming in and all that. There was already an environment where price of oil was beginning to shift to what the producers wanted. They wanted higher prices because they felt that they were not getting enough. So the geopolitical situation failed, but it allowed the increase in oil prices, and that empowered OPEC. Although it was not an OPEC decision, but that empowered OPEC, and it taught OPEC, and when I was an acting Secretary General Director of Research, my job was to try to present to the minister the supply and demand and how they impacted the prices. And our aim is to stabilize prices, stabilize supply and demand. And slowly, that became a very important tool in the hand of organization. Of course, the organization realized that it is not just there to serve its own members, because we recognize, I remember in the 2005, with China coming in and demand rising, we recognize that we have a responsibility also to be a player in the world scene, not just to be carried away by increasing prices. And that was led by Saudi Arabia, because Saudi Arabia has a lot to gain and a lot to lose. So the leadership of Saudi Arabia and the Gulf countries working with Saudi Arabia kind of stabilized the situation. And that led to what is known the cooperation between OPEC and IEA, and then the establishment of IEF. And I'll come back to that because I think lessons learned we sometimes forget.
Sure, thank you. Yes, so that gets to something. The role of Saudi Arabia, Megan, you highlighted that in terms of geopolitics. And then we've heard about the role of Saudi Arabia in terms of what some people have called acting as something of a stabilizing force or central bank of oil. I want to see, Jason, can you talk a little bit about that role of the Saudis in particular, but OPEC, and as it relates to thinking about price stability or the central bank? And Ed, I'm going to come to you for a follow-on.
There's been a lot of discussion about the geopolitical impact of the shale revolution. Megan wrote a fantastic book about that. I've always thought that the geopolitical influence that Saudi Arabia has globally, which I think is unique, greater than that of the United States or of Russia, even though they all produce a lot. The US produces much more, as Ed Morse reminded me the other day, not just crude oil, but total liquids production in the global market of 100 million barrels a day. But Saudi Arabia is the only country that, at some cost to itself, chooses to hold so-called spare capacity. It doesn't produce everything that it can. It holds some production back. Part of that is about price on a day-to-day basis. We can argue about whether it wants a higher price, but it means that when there's a disruption, and people are speculating about that today, what might happen as a result of this conflict? Might the US need to enforce sanctions more tightly against Iran? Would that lead to lost supply? What would we do if you needed to offset that supply? You have strategic stockpile, not as big as before, and you have Saudi spare capacity. There's not a lot of other options. And so being able to take that call in Riyadh and respond to it is part of where I think the geostrategic influence comes from. I was thinking about, and I'm curious if the panelists have thoughts, or after this event, if anyone else does, the dependence on the Middle East for oil, that shock of 1973 and the iconic lines at the gas station, it's really framed like almost every aspect of energy policy discussion in Washington ever since. We don't want to go from dependence on the Middle East for oil to dependence on China for minerals. That's the whole conversation now. And the world's changed a lot, as we talked about, in the last 50 years. And I was trying to think of another example where a country cut off oil exports or embargoed them to a certain place. You can think about it with gas, like Russia, and I think there are important reasons why. Gas is quite different than oil. If Russia were to cut off oil exports, it would be an enormous cost to Russia. It would be a cost to everyone else, but that cost would be diffuse. It's much harder to target it at a particular target the way maybe you could a half century ago.
Because oil is fungible.
Because you have a more
freely
global
around the
interconnected
world.
market. 50 years ago, oil was not traded on global exchange and the most globally traded commodity. So I think that the lessons we need to learn, and we look at the fact that today it's just a different, even the possibility of doing it is more remote because it doesn't exist as a tool in the same way. And I think the reason it doesn't, and we should think about that for minerals and a range of other things with well-functioning markets and diversification of supply, I think that's important because that's where energy security comes from.
Right. Well, I want to come to the point about thinking about the future and Middle East reliance or reliance on one region in a moment. But I want to roll back to the point I had asked you about, which is the role of Saudi Arabia. Again, this idea of as a swing producer. You'd given us a sketch of how it uses that spare capacity, that it maintains at great expense, costs billions of dollars to maintain it. In effect, they're taking money off the table by not producing oil that they could in return for some goals that they see as important. But Ed, is that the role that they play? Or do you see Saudi Arabia as they often like to portray themselves? We've heard the Saudi oil minister talk about it within the last 12 months as being a stabilizing force, and OPEC being a stabilizing force in the markets. Sometimes we've seen different kinds of behavior, haven't we?
Just to say, sometimes they're taking money off the table, sometimes the change in price offsets the loss.
Right.
of export
There's a market
supply.
share calculation. It's three-dimensional chess, of course.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I'd like to make a couple of observations on that, and I think it's a critical point. Saudi Arabia is in a position, given its size in the market, of having a bunch of free riders that tail along with it, and having spare capacity has proven to be, over time, a useful mechanism for preventing prices from going down too far. But in order to get to the point where prices go down too far, you have to make sure the prices do go down too far in order to induce cooperation. So just a couple of points on that. Saudi Arabia's production in 1980 and 81 was higher than it is today. And OPEC's total production capacity in 1980-81 is about the same as it is today. But we were then in the 60 million barrel a day market. We're now in the 100 million barrel a day market. So the influence of not having 50% of the market, but 30% of the market becomes a challenge at times. The first challenge that the Saudis confronted on the free rider issue was in the 1980s when, yes, oil demand did go down, and the Saudis had committed to be the price guarantor by adjusting its supply to meet demand. So they were producing 10.3 million barrels a day in 1980-81, and by the time we got to the winter of 85, they were producing 2.5 million barrels a day. So, you know, how do you defend yourself when you want to be the market stabilizer, other than making the market much less stable? And that's what they did. They opened up the taps. They went back not to 10.3 million a day, but to a significantly high level, and they did it overnight. And the price of oil cratered as a result. And then order was brought back into the market. So they have used the tool at their disposal, where I think the value of that spare capacity is the value of being able to discipline a market in order to provide greater stability in the long run.
Right. And one of the things that we did see, arguably, the Saudis did use the same technique to try to punish producers of shale oil, the United States.
Well, intriguingly, the same year that they lost market share in China and they lost market share in the United States, which was the year of the Crimean taken by Russia, they did open up the taps. And they said in that opening up the taps, and the then king was assured by the then oil minister that we know that Russian production is too expensive and US production is inexpensive, and the price can't go below 70 without us hurting both Russia and the United States, and we will then be able to balance the market.
Right.
The lesson of that was more complicated in a way. Russia, unlike Saudi Arabia, for example, has a floating currency. The currency rises and falls with the price of oil. And when the currency rises, it gets too expensive to produce oil. And when it goes down, it gets very cheap to produce oil. So the irony of it is you cut prices and you incentivize the Russians to drill more.
So your point being, spare capacity not only allows them to respond to calls from consumers, but instill discipline in producers.
Yes.
Yeah, right.
I want to ask Megan, who wrote the book on shale, is it right, and this is on a day today, those of you following the news will know that ExxonMobil has formalized its long-rumored bid to acquire the biggest player, Pioneer, in the US shale patch, creating a mega shale major, really doubling down on American oil, in particular in the Permian Basin, the heart of America. I was just in Midland last week, the heart of America's shale energy. Can you tell us, Megan, the broader impact of what initially companies like Exxon dismissed, which was the potential for tight oil or shale oil, that it was independents, of course, people like George Mitchell and entrepreneurs and innovators, hundreds, if not thousands of them that scrambled and built the US shale industry. Now we're seeing a doubling down stamp of approval from the leading Western supermajor with likelihood of shale remaining a force, is this a useful anti-OPEC in the marketplace, or how do you see this? Is this a climate nightmare? What's the right way to think about the biggest deal we've seen in many, many years in oil happening here in the American oil patch?
I'm sure there are many people in this room who have some really good thoughts on this. I would say that at first, initially, when shale was becoming a new phenomenon, a lot of people thought this was going to be an American, counterweight to OPEC, and that it was going to be able to play the role of stabilizing the market because it is a short cycle resource, meaning that you make a investment and you're going to see a payoff in terms of new production in a relatively short period of time.
And that's not true for all kinds of oil investments.
Right.
Oftentimes, it can take a decade or more, typically.
Exactly. And instead, we were looking at 6 months to a year in these beginning periods. So people really thought this is the antidote to Saudi Arabia in all kinds of ways. And as time went on, I think that it became clear that there was a lot of strategic utility to having shale. And it did change the American energy calculus in some very fundamental ways. But being able to turn more production on in 14 days versus 6 months or a year is not the same thing. And so it never really had the prospect of becoming America's spare capacity. That said, my feeling is that shale is going to be among the resources that are long lasting as we move forward in the energy transition, because as the world becomes less certain about how long we're going to be consuming oil at X level, it's still sensible to invest into shale because you're going to be able to get your production more quickly, right? So that allows you to say, I don't know what's going to happen in 10 years, but I feel pretty confident about where things are going to be in 1 year. So making a short cycle investment will seem to make more sense than making a much larger gamble that's going to pay off over a longer period of time.
So that's a very important point you make about the utility of shale in this kind of a world. Now, this is where we can pivot a little bit to thinking about where we are now and looking to the future. And we'll get to the demand topic, of course, which you rightly put on the table early on. Many of you will know the IEA, which has been referenced a few times today, the International Energy Agency. It's the counterweight, in a sense, the consumer representative organization set up in the wake of the oil shocks, particularly the 1973 oil shock, that collects information, puts out reports, and acts, in a sense, as a voice of consuming economies in dialogue with OPEC. They've been quite strong in arguing for a net zero transition. They put out an influential report in 2021, and they just updated it a few weeks ago, showing how the world can get to net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. If you read the most recent report very carefully, even though, which I have read, including the footnotes, I recommend it to you for bedtime reading. It'll put you out just like that. If The Economist is not handy, you can pick up the IEA report. No, it's actually riveting. Even on the greenest analysis, this is the net zero report, not the business as usual report, right? Meaning no extra policy. We really try really hard to achieve the Paris goals and get to net zero. It says, please, tight oil, meaning shale, they don't use the word shale, please invest in tight oil for the next decade. Please continue to invest in short cycle oil. In other words, the net zero forecast of the official IEA agency asks for further investments in short cycle oil of all types, including shale, precisely for this reason, its rapid response. And I think that's actually something of a U-turn from what we've heard from the agency before. It acknowledges a bigger truth that I wanted to get to, or a bigger challenge, that while in the last energy shocks, supply was the question mark, very much so with the 1973, and of course even bigger with 1979, with the Iranian Revolution, more oil was taken off the market than it was in 73. I would argue that going forward, demand is the great uncertainty, in part because many parts of the world want to achieve these climate targets that are quite ambitious, and we're trying to force an energy transition much faster than it might happen through markets or technology, organically, through policy. But countries are wavering in their policies, or their path of policy is uncertain. Consumers are fickle. And so demand did fall many years, thanks to American laws on fuel economy standards, CAFE laws that people will know about. But at some point with low oil prices, we lost enthusiasm for pursuing them. So I want to ask our gurus here, maybe Ed, I'll give you first crack at it since you brought up the topic. On demand, is it fair to say that we're going to need to do something much more serious about managing demand for oil in the next part of the energy transition to pursue some of these ambitious climate goals? And do you see it happening? Is there an appetite to do it? Or how do you define that transition?
Yeah, so I'm more optimistic than some people are on demand actually peaking and peaking sooner rather than later. So, we did an analysis in which the highest probability scenario is that total oil demand peaks before 2030. And
this is on business as usual, current scenario.
That's on business
no
as
additional
usual. Yeah.
extreme policies.
Yeah, and business as usual doesn't include some other policies, but part of it goes back to our own analysis of what happened post 1973, and to the comments that I made about Dan's comments on going into fuel oil from coal. We had remarkable drop in the use of fuel oil in power generation, and it enabled for some years for total oil demand to actually fall, and it fell by rounded 5 million barrels a day. Depending on whether you put natural gas liquids in or not. But if you take natural gas liquids out, a good 5 million barrels a day of lost drop demand took place. And it was a substitution of other things for oil in the power gen sector. And it's an intriguing lesson. If you I wrote the data down just so that I remember it. In 1965, 25% of OECD total demand was fuel oil for power generation.
It's hard to conceive of today, right? We hardly use any.
In 2002, it was 6%.
Right.
And it fell by half. It went up, and then it fell by half.
Yeah.
And part of it was accidental, in that we had Atoms for Peace program in 1956, and it took 20 years plus to get those nuclear reactors in place in Europe, in Japan, and the United States. And it happened that they played a major role in it. So that gives me, faith in the argument that business as usual does move to a peak demand. We've seen it already in China. China peaked its diesel demand, even going back 1.3 million of more diesel demand during the pandemic when gas prices were high.
Right.
They never had the record level that they had before. 2 Chinese companies have said this year that this is the year of peak gasoline demand. So China has, for all practical purposes, already peaked in transport fuel demand.
So you've laid out the case, substitution being one of it, but also a historical precedent for a demand peak coming fairly soon on global demand for oil. I want to turn to Adnan on this, and then I want to hear from our other 2 commentators. You were heading up the research at OPEC for a number of years, and we're close to the data. OPEC has just put out its forecast for 2045. And in sharp contrast with that net zero report that I just highlighted, that says by 2050, the world's oil consumption may be at a quarter or less of the current level. It predicts a very robust growth in oil consumption, far from peak. Can you give a perspective on the demand question? How does OPEC see this? How do you see this now with some distance away from OPEC? Because when I plot, as I have done for The Economist, the range of forecasts from the various respectable shops that look at energy, it's astonishing. It's breathtaking, the range of forecasts you'll see.
But net zero 2050 is not a forecast.
Agreed. Net zero is a scenario, but even the business as usual forecast. I mean, the IEA does scenarios, different shops do forecasts only. Exxon recently put out its forecast, not so different from the OPEC forecast. But could you tell us, what's your perspective on demand? Because clearly there's something embedded in that OPEC forecast that's very different than what it's saying.
Let me tell you first that what I've learned in this business, that if you go back 20 years ago and look at the figures that you forecasted for demand going forward, none of them comes out.
Everybody's wrong.
None of them, whether it's OPEC or IEA or EIA. So that's the first thing I tell you. And that's because behind each scenario, there are a set of assumptions. And those set of assumptions, usually you put set of assumption that works in your favor. Either you develop a scenario, IEA develops a scenario because they want energy security. So they want to move away from dependence on oil. So they put that in their scenarios. OPEC, on the other hand, they want more revenues. So they look in the assumptions, they look where the demand could be coming from the developing countries, from a failure for electric vehicles to penetrate. And they could come up with argument after argument after argument. In the same way that I don't believe the net zero emission scenario will materialize as it's prescribed. And I think even IEA, as you have said, they have a sort of a qualifier saying is that this is only a scenario. It is not the Bible. Although they go around and they say you have to stop investment in new oil and gas projects. God forbid, if you stop investing in new oil and gas projects, you're going to have a disaster in the world economy. So what is my perspective on the latest World Oil Outlook, which was launched in Riyadh a couple of days ago, I believe, and I watched it. I think to some extent it has some element of truth, but perhaps they were pushing their optimistic view in it, in the same way that IEA net zero emission is putting a lot of faith in the ability not only of the OECD countries to achieve the net zero emission, which I have no doubt they probably will, but probably not by 2050, maybe 2055. But they're putting a lot of faith that India and China, as Dan Yergin always says, the math does not add up. Sorry to borrow your comment. If China is going to reach 2060 net zero emission, and if India is 2070, and then the rest of the world has not said anything about net zero emission with the exception of few countries, the net zero emission is not going to materialize. So I would say somewhere between OPEC optimistic view about demand and somewhere between IEA pessimistic view on demand is what we're going to see. But if you ask my bet, I don't know.
Okay. a quick point.
I need to intervene because we do empirical analysis of that. We have done empirical analysis of it for years. And if you look at the relationship between GDP growth and oil demand growth for the last 75 years on a three-year moving average basis, there is a linear path downward. And that linear path downward is exactly the same for emerging markets as it is for advanced economies. So I think the onus is on those who claim that that linear pattern that is solidly there for the last 75 years is going to change, and why would it change?
Right, so the energy intensity of GDP, there's some excellent work actually from CGEP on this. I encourage you to look up that shows quite a significant decline year on year across countries over the decades. It does show that. The question I have left in my mind is what's left now that we've gotten rid of other uses of oil like heating by and large or electricity is hard to replace. That is, though electric vehicles are on the rise quite rapidly, they're still only about 2% of the global fleet. It takes time to penetrate, but the alternatives are coming, no doubt. So if we take a longer term view, one can see the future emerging, but it's not as easy as having 5 different alternatives to substitute for your oil burning boiler as there was in 1973, let's say. So I would just say this is a watch and see. Now, it's time to turn to your questions. I believe an iPad is going to be brought up to me. Thank you so much. And I'm going to ask if Dan can come and join us. There's a chair being set too. Fantastic. Great. And maybe Dan, I will start with you, if you don't mind. We have some questions from the audience that have been sent. And of course, I remind those of you on Zoom, you can use the chat feature to submit your questions. We're going to continue monitoring them in real time. As well, here in the audience, you can continue to submit your questions. Please update on my iPad. So Dan, you noted the 1970s became, quote unquote, the energy crisis decade. Are the 2020s on track for the same fate? What's your judgment? And how would we know?
The 2020s, I mean, the decade.
The current
now,
decade,
right?
yeah.
Well,
yeah,
we're already at 2023.
Right, so let's say 2023 to 2033.
Yeah.
Will this be the energy crisis decade as well?
No, I think this is the decade of really struggle over what an energy transition is and how it plays out. I think that's the great theme. And as has been mentioned, minerals become a much more important question in this decade. They've gone from this sort of boring thing called mining to this very important thing called critical minerals. And
they've been rebranded.
I think the rebranding I was with a group of mining industry people last week, and I was thinking critical minerals is a very good rebranding.
Yeah. The
First school
yeah,
of
jump in.
mining in the country.
Here, really?
What?
Well, take that, Colorado.
First school of mining in the country, Columbia.
You mean the first school of critical minerals?
There you go. Exactly. Actually, since you jumped in, maybe you can follow on that, because I know you've done some terrific work, and you've served as an advisor to the government and so on. Can you tell us what comes out of your analysis of the critical minerals challenge, and what sometimes is overblown? What's overhyped in terms of the challenges involved? I might ask Megan to come in on this as well.
Yeah,
since
she
you've
and
written
I have
about
done a
this.
lot of work together and co-chaired a task force that made some recommendations to the US Congress about this. By the way, I was striking listening to the conversation because I heard the word optimistic used to mean two different things.
Yeah.
Oil demand peaks or oil demand keeps going up. So it really depends what your view is and what you're thinking about.
You have a hammer, the whole world looks like a nail, right?
in
So-
this transition. But it was a great exchange, and transitions take time. There are some lessons from oil markets, from oil security, from the Arab oil embargo for how we think about meeting the challenge of critical minerals around the world. There is more concentration for minerals than for oil. The largest producers of oil, the US, Russia, and Saudi, 10, depending on how you define it, 15, 20% of world supply. But the largest producers of lithium, of cobalt, of rare earths, each produce more than 50% of world supply, and 60, 70, 80% of the refining and processing, depending on what you're talking about today, is located in China, although that doesn't have to be. That's not a function of geology, it's a function of investment in manufacturing. So there is more concentration today. I talked before about the lessons of diversification and transparency, which Western countries are trying to catch up. China's been making these investments for quite a long time. There are, I think, in a world of increasing fragmentation and protectionism, there are a lot of lessons about how security, as Dan said with that famous quote from Churchill, variety and variety alone, we need to be embracing partnerships and trade, not backtracking from it, if you want to have security in minerals. Transparent, well-functioning markets and diversification of supply is where security can come from. And one other point just to keep in mind is, minerals are not energy. Minerals are an input to a manufactured good that can store energy or produce energy like a solar panel. A disruption in those supply chains means that the cost of a battery or an EV goes up. There may be a 6-month delay. There may be higher prices. It doesn't affect mobility today the way a disruption in oil supply does. So the risks are somewhat different as well. And I wrote a piece recently how I think there are more demand side potential responses too, through improvements in battery chemistry, which we have a lot of colleagues at Columbia working on, potential for recycling. So some of the things we saw with oil on the demand side a half century ago, we should be pursuing demand solutions in addition to the fact that we'll need to do more mining for sure for minerals.
So Megan, please come in, and I'm going to give you a chance to come in, Dan. I know you want to join.
Sure. I think to answer your question very specifically about what is overblown about it, it sort of requires beginning at why are people so hysterical about the relationship between China and critical minerals and the impact on US foreign policy. And I would say maybe not hysterical here in New York, but in Washington, there's a certain amount of hysteria around it. And that is just because there is this Chinese dominance of supply chains, clean energy supply chains, and probably critical minerals is the area where it's most pronounced. And so I think there is some truth to the fact that this dominance in clean energy supply chain gives China a certain amount of leverage, and that leverage will matter to the U.S. economy going forward, because that gives China the ability, as things are right now, to influence the pace at which the pace and the cost at which America and other countries could pursue the energy transition. And if that is considered to be a national interest, which certainly the Biden administration does consider it to be, then that is certainly something that would matter. And there's also concerns that the Chinese might use their dominance of clean energy supply chain in a geopolitical conflict that doesn't involve energy, but it might be brought in to just exert leverage. So I think at the highest level, that's the picture. But as Jason suggested, when we get into the details, the analogy with the 1973 embargo does not really hold because of the point that Jason made about it being an input rather than an end product. But there's also the reality that China may process the overwhelming majority of certain critical minerals, but they also are the overwhelming majority of the global market for a lot of these minerals. So, maybe they process 72% of the world's cobalt, but they consume 62% of the world's cobalt. So, there's a lot more work that needs to be done. And I know CGIP and others are doing this work, and it's really important to right size the threat, if we want to call it a threat, so that policymakers can better understand what's the leverage that China has, what are our options for, minimizing that, and how can we be more comfortable in the space that we're going to be, which inevitably will mean that China is going to have a lot of influence here, but maybe not quite as much as it does right now.
It's really helpful to hear this sort of realism, dimensioning of the challenge. Dan, I know your shop is done.
Let me go, Adnan, and then
I'll give you the last word on this. Go ahead.
Okay, but Adnan.
No, I wanted to comment on this, and I think I was recently in a tour of Berlin and Brussels, meeting with German officials, energy officials, and in Brussels, the EU. And the EU has been very much a renewable as part of the energy transition. Sure. And that's a problem. And I think the solution to that, and that's probably also about these rare earth energy supply, the solution that is now setting in as a result of the Ukraine war is that energy security is now telling them you have to be more pragmatic. You have to allow not just green hydrogen, you have to allow blue hydrogen, you have to allow even nuclear. Even the Germans are saying, okay, for the rest of Europe to have some nuclear, although they will not have it themselves. So I think if you really want to move away from these problems, is that don't put all of your eggs in one basket, either on the sources or the resources. Right. And if you do that, we'll be in a much better situation in the future. And that's what we have learned from the embargo. That's what we have learned, not just even in Russia. And remember what happened in Russia. The European tried to sanction the oil, and the Russian tried to use the gas. And both of these things touch upon energy security. So if you did not have enough dependence on Russia, whether it's oil or gas, you wouldn't have got into this problem. That's, I think, the secret for it.
So two quick data points. Yeah. First, on minerals, we did a study. We S&P said, okay, let's take the EU goals or the Biden goals on climate and energy transition, and then say, well, what does that mean in terms of technology? And then let's look at sub-technologies. What does that mean? How much copper would you need? It's basically concluded you have to about double copper production by 2035, unless you have amazing breakthroughs on innovation. And it takes about 20 years to develop a new mine. So that's one data point. The other is 2 weeks ago, I testified to the Senate Energy Committee on a critical minerals hearing. And my data point is that every single senator, except maybe one, the main thing they wanted to talk about, the main thing about critical minerals on their mind was China.
We're going to do a speed round in closing us out because we're almost out of time. A very interesting question. As we enter into a world of declining oil demand, and we don't have to debate what's the pace of that decline, let's leave that open for the moment. But as we look at that kind of a future, a climate concerned future with declining oil demand, each of you, give me your first thought on what will be the most important impact on market structure, geopolitics, national oil companies, whatever comes to your mind about something we should keep our eyes open for and watch. Maybe even some unexpected areas.
Could you rephrase? No, I'm not going to be the first one to answer. I just want to say, what's the predicate of that?
Sure.
The predicate
so the questioner is asking, what will be the impact of going into a world of declining oil demand on a variety of actors, or in geopolitics, or on national oil companies, on capex of oil producers? So the person is, I think, rightly asking, how is this going to affect the world as we know it, rather than being in a world of that we lived previously? If we move into a world where we forcibly ratchet down demand through policy, which is unprecedented in human history, really, in terms of energy, what implications can we rightly anticipate? Jason, start with you.
Sure.
Quick,
That's
short and sharp answer.
Very short. First, it means we are beginning to get on track for our climate goals. And so we should remember when we ask a question like that, the implications of not doing that are, Adnan talked about disaster in the global economy. There are other disasters looming if we don't start to bring down oil, gas, coal use and emissions. If demand starts to fall, there's a lot of consequences. Let me just mention
name one big one.
One that's been on my mind, which is which supply falls off the stack first. You might say markets figure that out. Whatever's most expensive is going to go. So imagine a world where a country like, let's say the US, which is not the highest cost supplier, but hypothetically, we see a world where demand is falling, US supply is falling, US jobs are being lost, and as much oil is coming from the Middle East as before. US policymakers will not allow that to happen. And that will be true in country after country. And so the question of what steps countries take to make sure that they are the last person standing for economic and security reasons, or if you're in low-income developing countries, you say as a matter of equity and justice, you know, Norway, Texas, you got to develop your resources. What about us? There's some number of decades left. We want some of that.
Okay.
It leads to potential tension and conflict as countries try to make sure that
everyone wants to be the last man standing. Not everybody can be, right? Okay, Ed, how would you answer
I actually don't think everyone wants to be the last person standing.
Tell me, yeah, what?
And I think the result of that is that we're going to have extremely uneven, volatile, violent changes between surplus and deficit, and that this leads to unhappiness domestically and internationally.
More volatility.
More volatility.
Yeah.
What you and Megan have called the jagged energy transition.
Yeah.
Over to you, Megan.
Similar to what has been said, I would say one thing I really will want to watch is when Gulf producers shift their strategies from being focused on price to be focused on market share. And, you know, thinking back to March of 2020, when we saw Saudi Arabia and Russia engage in a market share strategy opposed to a price one, it can look very different very quickly.
Very interesting. And then, how would you answer the question of declining demand? How will it affect?
Quickly, I think two things will come. There will be less reasons to go to war or to go for sanctions because of oil. So that's good in general for the world, because I think we have seen most of the sanctions, by the way, or the embargoes were from the US on producer rather than the reverse. So we'll see less of that. Second, I think there will be a fight between the producers themselves, especially the newcomers. And I've seen that even in the World Energy Outlook that's going to come out. They have a scenario that's completely unthinkable, that's saying that Saudi Arabia has to give some of its share to Guyana. Things of that sort.
Right.
You know, may happen, but these are the issues that we never thought about before.
Dan, bring us home.
Okay, well, I think investment falls off globally. Consolidation in the industry continues apace. And don't assume that prices are going to go down. They may go up.
Right. Okay, so here you have it from our panel of leading experts, a jagged energy transition that has left us with at least as many questions about the future as we had, but at least our questions about the past have been well answered. Please join me in giving them a nice round of applause. I thank our panelists. I thank you. CGEF's overarching goal, of course, has been to illuminate these complicated topics. We thank you all for joining us, and for those who tuned in, the full video recording will be available on the website in a couple of days, and a full listing of events can also be found on the website as well. We hope you enjoy the rest of your evening and look forward to seeing you soon.
Thank you.